Hello, this lecture is entitled Introducing Political Theory, and like the title indicates, we're going to be talking a little bit about what exactly it is we're going to be doing this semester. Now, the first thing to note is that political theory is a contested arena. This is not unique to our field, but it is certainly something to keep in mind as you go through all of the readings and texts in the course. In most fields, there's some overlapping agreement on what the core subject matter is, but also disagreement. And the kinds of disagreement uh, can be as follows, right? So the boundaries of the field are sometimes a little fuzzy. That's to say, what counts as within the field. So, for example, biology and chemistry have a fuzzy boundary at some level. Another thing that many fields debate about is about the best methods of inquiry. And here, political science is a great example where a qualitative methodologist and quantitative methodologist end up disagreeing about what the best methods are to study political phenomena. And finally, which academic departments should ultimately be in control of the direction of this field. So, for instance, should philosophy of science be in philosophy departments, or should it be left up to various science departments to decide what counts as philosophy of science and good philosophy of science? Now, political theory, which is often the name given to it by political scientists, or political philosophy, which is what philosophers generally call the field, is probably more contested than most fields. And one reason that this is so is because not everybody agrees exactly on what it is that they're supposed to be doing in political theory, or how they're supposed to go about doing it for that matter. Some theorists believe that to study political theory, we must first study ethics. Political theory, on this view, is a sub-branch of ethics, ethics just applied to politics. Others believe that political theory is best understood as a branch of social science, where theorists study the history and development of political values that people endorse, and maybe then political theory can tell us about what's important to study in light of those values. Now, this slide is entitled Methodenstreiten, which is a German word for simply for disagreements about methodology. Because of the previous disagreements about what exactly it is that political theorists are supposed to be studying, there's going to be vigorous debates about methods as well, how to do political theory. Those who see political theory as a branch of ethics and moral philosophy focus on developing logically consistent applications of ethical theories to the behavior of political actors or to the evaluation of political institutions. Those who see political theory as an investigation into a particular society or a civilization's mores, that is to say their values, focus on tracing the historical development of ideas, often by analyzing the influence of great books that are supposed to have had a great influence on the development of the values of a particular society. So as a consequence, it's not surprising that because of these foundational and methodological disputes, political theorists find themselves in different academic departments, principally in political science and philosophy departments. And you'll note that at Austin Peay, this course essentially exists both in the political science department and in the philosophy department, with different titles, different professors, and with syllabi that are partially overlapping, but nonetheless quite distinct as well. You'll note also that many contributors to the field of political theories are also outside these two departments, so in departments of literature and linguistics or sociology or elsewhere. And we'll note that there's often a course about ethics and values in nearly every department that you can think of. In other words, biology departments have bioethics. In social work, there's an ethics of social work course. In sociology, there's an ethics course. There's a business ethics course in the business school. And this is true not just at Austin Peay, but also around the country. So in other words, there are practitioners of political theory in a great variety of fields, all of whom bring a slightly different perspective to the study of this subject matter. Now, most courses that you will take in political theory, depending on who's teaching them and depending on what department they're being taught in, are going to be taking an implicit stand on all of the debates that I just mentioned. That is to say, methodological debates, debates about what it is exactly that is supposed to be studied, and which authors, are most relevant to study. Professors are therefore making choices, either implicitly or explicitly, about which authors are most important to read based on how they answered the questions that we just raised. And you're probably going to be curious about where your professor stands on these issues. But I'm not going to do that in this class. Um, Instead, we're going to try to focus on the overlapping consensus that exists between these different fields, particularly between political science and philosophy, which are the ones that I'm most familiar with, and focus on texts that nearly everybody agrees are foundational. Now, one thing that's worth noting, and I don't know if this is a point in favor of one or the other of these sides in this dispute, is that a vast majority of theorists who wrote up until the 20th century wrote as if they were political philosophers. In other words, what they did was not attempt to provide the best articulation and defense of the values inherent in their culture or civilization, but they wanted to make bolder, broader claims about what is the right way to live together and what are justified and unjustified uses of coercion by the state. In other words, they wanted to know the truth about what rights we have and where those rights come from, not just try to articulate what their contemporaries thought what rights they had and where they came from. Ultimately, you're going to have to decide for yourself whether or not there are right answers about which political institutions we should adopt, or whether there are some ways of living together that might really be better than others. You're going to also need to decide for yourself whether you want to sit on the sidelines, so to speak, and just analyze or comment the action, or whether you want to step into the ring and stake some claims about what is or is not desirable. Now, since you can't make that decision without at least trying out both, your work in the class will involve both of these types of work. That is to say, you're going to be both asked to analyze certain political debates, and you're also going to be asked to take a stand, make an argument, and ultimately justify your own political views. Now, let me say a quick note about the course text that I've assigned. I've assigned you texts each week that I think are worth thinking about. The fact that something was assigned, though, is not an endorsement on my part of the views you will find inside those texts. In fact, I actually strongly disagree with a lot of what you'll find in this course. But that doesn't mean that I don't think it's worth studying, and that doesn't mean I don't think the problems that are raised by these texts aren't really worth thinking about. Now, in most classes at the undergraduate level, particularly in the first 2 years, you read texts because the professor wants to give you some piece of true information. So, for example, when you learn in political science majors, when political science majors learn about the founding of the American Republic, they usually are reading their professor's best guess as to what happened at that moment and why. In other words, they're being asked to learn some things that other scholars believe to be true about our history and about the way American politics works. But in this class, your readings really are more here to help you think. That is to say, they're not your professor's best guess as to what's true and what's not true. Instead, they're often the presentation of particular problems or particular arguments that have exercised a strong influence on our politics right up until today. And the analysis of these political problems is supposed to enrich you and help you think more critically about the world in which you live, as well as the world that this world came from, and what perhaps we should do about it in the future. So critical thinking starts from page 1 of this course. For example, on the first page of the first PDF I'm having you read, which comes out of a textbook called Introduction to Political Theory by a number of different authors. Already on page 1, I disagree with the way they conceptualize the enterprise of normative political theory. The authors claim that normative political theory is essentially action guiding. That is to say, that what is normative is about what you should do, and that everything else is a question of empirics. That is to say, the way the world is. In other words, they say, or they claim, that a theory is not normative unless it tells you what you should do. But in my view, that's clearly false. Normative political theory can also be evaluative. Sometimes It's just trying to tell you what results or what actions or what character traits are better or worse without making strong claims of what you should do about this. The difference is that knowing what's good or what's better does not yet tell you what you should do. That would require you to believe that what you should do is a straightforward question that follows from knowing what the good is. But of course, what you should do is often dependent on a lot of complicated empirical questions about cause and effect of your actions in the world, as well as the relations between intentions and outcomes. So, one example, for instance, is many philosophers think that happiness is good. In fact, a few philosophers think that happiness is the ultimate good. But does it follow, therefore, that everybody should try really hard to be happy, should aim at happiness, that that is what they should do? And I think the answer is often no. Some of our best moments of happiness come from aiming to do other things. And it turns out that our happiness is a byproduct of trying or aiming at other types of goods. And so what that tells you is that there's nothing straightforward about um, X being good and therefore knowing what to do about that, um, if anything. So, in conclusion, uh, a trained political scientist is teaching this class. So, it's probably the case that facts about the world are going to be at times relevant to our discussions. On the other hand, this particular political scientist has spent a lot of time talking to philosophers, including a stint teaching in a philosophy department at the University of Arizona in 2009, 2010, which means we're not merely going to be examining the history of ideas, we're also going to try to think a little bit about whether any of these ideas are right or which ones are right and which ones might be mistaken. In other words, sometimes you're going to be asked to ethically justify your views. But no matter how you see the enterprise of political theory, at the end of the day, I think there's some points that nearly everybody agrees on. For one, defining your concepts clearly is of paramount importance. We cannot have a rich conversation if we're not clear about what it is that we're talking about. So when we're talking about key concepts in political theory, like rights or democracy or freedom, when we talk about these things, we're going to have to be clear what it is that we're talking about, given that not everybody means the same thing when they're referring to that particular concept. A second thing we want to do is try to make our assumptions explicit. What are we assuming about the world, about human nature, about which ethical principles are true? In other words, we need to lay our cards out on the table for other people to examine them. In a way, this is a consequence of the scientific method at some level, that we want, just like science needs, the method needs to be public. That is to say that we need to be able to evaluate and assess the methods used to arrive at the conclusion in any scientific study. Similarly, in our field of study, we're going to have to make our normative assumptions explicit. What are we holding to be true, and what are we not necessarily holding to be true or staying agnostic about? That's going to be an important part of what we're doing. And finally, we really need to proceed from reasons to conclusions, not the other way around. And again, this is another consequence of doing things scientifically or rationally. Psychology has a lot to tell us about how, unless we're vigilant, our brains often work overtime to try and justify the conclusions we want to believe. In other words, oftentimes we have a conclusion that we think is right, and therefore we backtrack and try to find reasons to support that conclusion. But in this class, I think we really want to go the other way around. We want to think about which fundamental principles we think are correct, and then reason about them to try to figure out what institutions and what laws and what kinds of political actions might be justified in light of those. In other words, we're going to be arguing about reasons and then see where those reasons take us in terms of conclusions. Well, there you have it. 14 minutes, a little longer than I wanted to, but this is ultimately an introduction to what I think is the essence of the enterprise in which we're engaged in. See you on the other side.